You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, welcome along to the latest Today's Conveyancer podcast. Today I'm chatting about property logbooks, and who better to talk to them about than Nigel Walley. Nigel is a managing director of a property logbook provider, Chimni, but is also, and importantly for the course of this conversation, the chair of the Residential Logbook Association, which is a self-regulatory body of logbook providers, and really want to drill into that as well today, Nigel, so I'm not going to say too much more. Delighted to have you on the podcast. Really appreciate you joining. Thank you. In the first instance, tell us a little bit about yourself. I know you've got quite an interesting background, not particularly a property background.
No, not at all, actually. I come from the digital consumer services industry. So for the last 30 years, I've been running a consultancy that worked with people like the BBC and Sky and Virgin on the development of online consumer services, whether it's television or broadband, those kind of things. So my background is in helping old-fashioned industries kind of transition into this strange new digital world. And I got into this, as I'm sure many people in the prop tech world did, by buying a house. Having watched various industries like telecoms and TV and advertising go through their own digital revolutions over the last 30 years, I was just kind of horrified and slightly amazed at how little digitization I experienced buying a house. And at the end of the process, I was sitting at home when this great big cardboard box arrived from my conveyancer with a whole load of documents that for my new home. And I stood looking at this box, and it suddenly dawned on me that every single other organization that we had encountered in the process of buying a house had ended up with a whole load of interesting information in their systems about my new house. And I ended up with a cardboard box, and it didn't seem right. So, and that kicked off the long journey to something which eventually became the logbook company I run, Chimni.
I think the really interesting thing about somebody like yourself with a different background is you don't bring, and you can't see me because this is a podcast, but the baggage in inverted commas with you into the sector. Do you see that as an advantage?
I think so, because all the logbook companies, we are a kind of fresh pair of eyes on the process, and we're looking at what's happening from a very different perspective. I think lots of organizations who are involved in the digitization of conveyancing are taking it very much on that basis. How do we digitize conveyancing? And we're trying to look at it from a completely different perspective, which is, what does the homeowner need? How is the homeowner changing, and how does that affect what they're going to want out of the conveyancing process in the future? And they're very different questions.
I think we'll probably cover off what the homeowner wants or needs throughout the course of the discussion, Nigel. But we've started off by talking about logbooks, and and for the uninitiated, because there may be a few of them listening, talk about what a property logbook is, because there are a few misnomers and a few myths to bust.
Yeah, so at core, we are a secure online account where you can store documents, but increasingly store data about your home. So, and I know if I can preempt one of your questions, one of the things we get asked a lot, which is a great question, which is, why is that different from Google Docs or a Dropbox account? And we actually like that question because we like Google Docs and Dropbox. And one of the things we say to people is actually, yeah, a logbook is a very property specific version of Google Docs and Dropbox, but with two key differences. The first difference is that the logbooks, as well as having the ability to store lots of documents and PDFs like you can in Google Docs and Dropbox, we are increasingly integrated with data sources like land registry, your local council, and other data sources. So the logbook has much more of a live data dashboard element to it, which you don't get in Dropbox. And one of the jobs of the RLBA is making sure we can access, or the logbook members can access more of that data. So more of your EPC data will be coming into your logbook directly as a data feed. If you've got things like a fencer certificate, that information will be dragged in as a data feed. So it's a much more intelligent property oriented version of a Dropbox. But the reason we like the analogy with those is they are both secure. They are both owned by the owner. They're not, or everything in your Dropbox account and your property logbook account is owned and controlled by you, the homeowner. So that's the first big difference, is that integration-y bit. The second bit, which is really important, which comes from all the work we've been doing with the Law Society over the last few years and the Home Buying and Selling Group, is that logbooks are now being viewed as a digital asset related to your home. So it actually is being enshrined kind of in law as an asset that you have to recognize. And so if you look at the new BASB form, for instance, when you're listing out fixtures and fittings and things that you're going to sell with your property, you have to flag up if there is a digital logbook for the property, and that logbook has to be passed over to a new owner. And that's something you don't get obviously with Dropbox. So this idea that everything in your logbook constitutes a complete digital asset that you sell with the property is the second big difference. But beyond that, as I say, we like the analogy with Dropbox and Google Docs.
And is the idea that this is automatically collated in some way, so that it's sort of, the homeowner doesn't have to go off and find their fence certificate for the sake of argument, or doesn't have to go off and find their energy provider? I mean, we often forget that, or find the bills, for example.
Yeah, the simple answer is we're getting there on that. If you look at all the logbook companies in the RLBA, we are at the moment probably too heavily weighted towards the homeowner having to do stuff. The homeowner having to find that stuff and upload it and make sure it's in there. And what we're working really hard as a group of companies to knock on the door and get access to these data feeds so that it can be more automatic. Our utopian outcome is every single bit of data which is held somewhere out in the ether about your home will be reachable and storable via your logbook eventually. But we're still having to work on getting into local authorities and getting hold of their data, and they're being very slow to share. We're still having to work on our relationship with the land registry and our relationship with other data holders like EPC, Fencer, Trustmark, all these organisations. So come back to me in 3 or 4 years' time, and I'll be able to say, yes, it's almost completely automatic. Right now it isn't, but it's our objective.
I suppose the challenge there is whether they've got systems that enable you to access them. And I suspect if it's anything like banking, for the sake of argument, which is held together by sticky tape and glue, they probably don't.
Yeah, no, it's a big problem. Local authorities in particular have got systems which weren't designed for sharing data outward with other companies, and very often they've also got contracts with systems providers that forbid it. When you look at all of the data that's held either in the public sphere or the commercially protected sphere, like utility data, both sets of data are currently sitting in systems that weren't built for this strange new world we're moving into, this kind of interoperable, machine readable, shareable world we're moving towards. So it's a slightly slow process at the moment.
So if that's what a logbook is and does, what is the benefit to a conveyancing practitioner? What's the benefit to the transaction of a logbook?
We make the case that there's 2 parts of the transaction we need to look at, and they're slightly different. So if you look at it from the perspective of the seller and also from the perspective of the buyer, if we take those 2 things separately, the first one, the seller, if a homeowner has got an up-to-date logbook, they kept all their documentation, etc., together, that logbook should be able to produce all the information that they will be asked to produce by their conveyancer. So in a utopian world, someone with a logbook presses a button that says, I want to sell my house. They press a button, they create a seller's pack of information based on the new standards that have been debated and set up by the Home Buying and Selling Group. And that information could and should squirt over the ether into the systems run by their conveyancer. So the conveyancer doesn't then have to go back and get them to fill out a form, get them to go and find information. It should all be there. And they're slightly utopian, I do recognise that. So that's the selling part of the benefit, and it should cut weeks out of the process whereby currently a conveyancer has to badger their own client to produce documents and data on their home. The second part of it, which is actually the busiest part for us at the moment, is actually for the buyer. In a world where everybody's got a logbook, the conveyancer who's represented the buyer should be just making sure that the person they've represented can get access to the existing logbook. But as we know, there's probably only, we think, just under 500,000 logbooks in the UK at the moment. So most people who are buying, there isn't a logbook for that property. So what we're all concentrating on, the members of the RLBA, is actually getting the buying conveyancer to set up a logbook on behalf of their client, rather than at the end of the buying process, the conveyancer emailing over all the documents to their client, or like in my case, sending a cardboard box around full of paper. What they're now doing, the conveyancers who are working with logbook companies, they're setting a logbook up at the end of the process, making sure that the documents are moved from the case management system into the logbook, and the buyer not only gets presented with a nice set of keys to their new home, but they also get presented with a digital record of the transaction, and over time with things like all the information for them to take over the digital systems in the property. So if the home's got Google Nest or British Gas Hive on the central heating, the information can be put in the logbook. If the home's got an alarm, it can be put in the logbook. So that increasingly complex handover of digital stuff in a home can be managed with the logbook. So they're the two bits we talk about, the selling portion and the buying portion.
You say there's about 500,000 logbooks at the moment in the UK, and we said we'd come back to this point about what buyers want or what homeowners want. Is that, this is a loaded question, Nigel, is that an indication that homeowners don't want logbooks if we haven't got that many out there at the moment?
No, it's not a loaded question. We're conscious that most homeowners aren't yet aware that logbooks are a thing, they're out there, and they're trying to be rolled out.
It's an awareness piece rather than a...
Yeah. Okay. But I think we always talk about context. And the thing we're saying to the conveyancing industry is that the context for all of this stuff is changing. We all, 15 years ago, everything was paper or just beginnings of PDF, and a homeowner had nothing at the beginning, had nothing at the end except a set of keys. But we're moving into a world now where most homeowners have got a smartphone with apps on. They're increasingly expecting part of the conveyancing process to be manageable through their phone and their apps. Everything is managed through emails and PDF exchange. And what we're beginning to see is that they're also using apps to run their homes. So, as I say, they've got British Gas Hive on their central heating. They've got Ring Doorbell with an app, that they may have 3 or 4 different apps for their home. So there's a beginning of an expectation amongst homeowners that they will have access to the data, they'll have control of data, they will be able to see a process on their phone. So the context is changing over time, and we can see that in who's taking up logbooks. When we work with the conveyancers who are selling Chimni logbooks, for instance, we can see that the take-up is much higher in first-time buyers, under 45s, and actually high net worth and large homes where there's lots of data and documentation. So we can begin to see segments who are leaping into this world. And it's about time. In a decade, I wouldn't be surprised if 75% of the homes in the UK don't have a digital logbook. Our message to conveyancers is to accept that process is happening and actually be the people who are responsible for helping your clients get onto that process.
Well, there's a question, isn't there? So who is responsible? I mean, you've already alluded to upfront information and material information. This is a big debate that's happening. Obviously, there's an element of logbooks that will help with that, I'm sure. But whose responsibility is this? Because all of this stuff seems to fall between the cracks, between the lenders, between the estate agents, between the conveyancers and the homeowners at the moment. What's your view on that?
Well, we are talking about something which should be a digital asset of the property, a legally recognised asset. So we think there's a strong case that conveyancers should be helping homeowners get into this kind of new digital storage space. We set up logbooks. It makes sense for your conveyancer, as they're effectively your legal partner, to set this thing up and set up a logbook, and the conveyancer can get lots of benefits out of it. We're saying to conveyancers, you need to move away from a situation where you're seen as an organisation that just helps people with a one-off transaction. The number of people who can't remember the name of the conveyancer they used a few years after the transaction is incredibly high. It's madness. It's really inefficient for an industry to just focus on processing transactions like this. And so logbooks, we think, are a way that conveyancers can start to think about building a digital relationship with homeowners for the life cycle of of them living in that home. It creates an asset which, if they work with companies like ours, they end up with a kind of a co-brand opportunity. So we're trying to move to a situation where homeowners have a reason to go into their logbook every week, and it gives the conveyancer therefore an opportunity to be embedded in a process of home management, which means they're ever present, and it gives them an opportunity to do other things, cross-sell and upsell other related services, be there as a legal fallback. And actually, a great example, if I can throw one in, a slightly human example. I live in a part of West London where they're digging a super sewer under our homes. And so somewhere at the end of my garden, 80 feet down, they're building a super sewer. And we've been all served with a compulsory purchase notice about them. They're buying the ground rights 80 feet down under my garden. So this great big legal doc arrives in my thing. And my wife and I looked at each other and like, well, we should get them to read this. We can't remember who we used to buy the house. And this is utterly mad. We used a legal company to buy our house. We can't remember who. We've got a legal problem related to our house. We're going to have to think up somebody to go and show it to. So we have to wander into somebody who doesn't know us, say, you don't know us, but we've got this thing, and set the whole thing up again. Whereas in the world we're envisaging, that would be a natural thing. We would load that up in the logbook. I'd ping the conveyancing company a note to say, can you just check in our logbook file, because our logbook will be attached to their systems. There's a new legal thing we've come in, we'd like to talk to you about. And they theoretically, in this utopian world, should be able to open up their systems, see us, see the link to the logbook, see the new documentation that's been uploaded, and we could have a sensible conversation.
You've talked a number of times in the course of the discussion already about this sort of open data world, this place where we can share all of this information quite easily, quite readily. And we've talked about some of the limitations, in the sense that there are some tech limitations that we're not going to get away from particularly quickly. What other frustrations have you come across, and what other blockers are you seeing that is preventing the implementation of property logbooks from your experience?
Access to data is obviously a big one, but that's quite a broad phrase. And we've touched, as you say, on some of the tech problems of accessing data. We do think that there is still a cultural problem in viewing the homeowner as a participant in this. And what I mean by that is there's no expectation currently amongst some of the other organisations who are building new digital systems for conveyancing. There's no expectation that the homeowner will be able to or want to access data that's being created. So what we're seeing amongst the big organisations like the Land Registry and GeoPlace is that their only expectation with the homeowner is that they will go to a website and look up some data. And we've been flagging up that in this new world, with homeowners with their smartphones and their apps, they will expect the same API access to this data that the law firms are getting. And it's been a complaint of ours at the RLBA recently that this isn't happening. So there is no mechanism currently for a logbook to be able to access data from things like the Land Registry on the same basis that a conveyancer has. Your conveyancing company can get better access. They can get free access to data in some instances that isn't available to a homeowner via the kind of the machine-to-machine connections that their systems can set up. But those things aren't offered to the homeowner. And that condition is repeated quite often around the industry. The expectation is that if the homeowner is going to want data, they can either come to a website and put their credit card in, or they can go to their professional, their conveyancer, and ask them to access it. And so it's a massive kind of cultural issue about the expectation of homeowners using digital systems like logbooks to automatically access data. And so we're looking to shift the understanding amongst data providers and system services providers in the industry to bring the homeowners to the table.
I think if you spoke to the average conveyancer, they would tell you that the homeowners aren't interested in this. All they're interested in is they want the keys. When can I get the keys? When can I move in? When can I put the log burner in that I thought I saw when I first looked around the house? When can I get the nursery sorted, because that room upstairs was absolutely spot on? Is there some evidence that homeowners want this information, Nigel?
I like to go back to kind of other examples. I worked on the launch of mobile phones in the UK quite a long time ago, and our most aggressive forecasts had 1 in 10 people taking a mobile phone. And they were the absurd forecasts. They were the ones that we, God, if we hit that. And of course, we've now got to the point where the average is actually 1.3. So people have more than one mobile phone on average in the UK. So I think with all new digital technologies, there is always this point where the old guard can't see why anyone will want it. And at some point, the hockey stick starts to kick up. So, if you genuinely think that homeowners in 10 years' time won't have a secure digital record for their property, which contains all key information, you're really not reflecting properly on what's happened over tech for the last 30 years. So, every single major tech innovation has been confronted by people who say we don't need it, all the way back to the telephone. There's brilliant quotes about people up in the city of London looking at the telephone and deciding they don't need it because they have boys to do the running for them. So when I hear somebody say in the legal industry, I'm sure homeowners don't want this, I just hear those people who couldn't understand that a telephone might take off, and because they had boys to do their running messages for them, or when the mobile industry arrived and it was inconceivable we want this. I worked on the launch of consumer email addresses. I was working for what became Virgin at the time, and I did a company talk. This is internally, and there was 400 people, and I asked them to put their hand up if they had an email address, and only 2 people put their hand up. And within obviously a year, everyone in the company had one, and within 3 years, I think it was 25% of the country had one. So we went from a situation where no one had an email address, no one knew what they were or why they wanted it, to sudden adoption. And again, the average now is 3.5 email addresses per person in the UK. So I'm quite happy if a large chunk of the industry don't think this is going to happen, because we'll work with the other chunk and put those guys out of business.
The famous phrase that comes to mind is, I think Henry Ford said, if I'd asked somebody what they wanted, they'd have said faster horses.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's like, this is unfortunately, a lot of the digital conveyancing process is working under the faster horses principle. The people in charge of digitizing the conveyancing industry have looked at the conveyancing industry and said, how can we turn that digital, rather than asking, in a world where consumers are taking up all of these services, what would a property transaction look like if the world was different? And that's a much more interesting question.
That, if you don't mind me saying, Nigel, is the approach of somebody that doesn't bring the property baggage, perhaps, that I mentioned at the start, because the lawyer would turn around and say, well, the issue is that the law doesn't allow us to do that because of X, Y, Z.
Well, I mean, there's nothing in the law preventing a homeowner having access to data and using data and cutting weeks out of the conveyancing process now, even if we leave the conveyancing process exactly as it is. If somebody, which is part of the rationale for the upfront information regime, we are big fans and supporters of that. Our argument is that actually, if a homeowner had a logbook, they will be absolutely prepared to do that, and they could cut 15 weeks out of the conveyancing process by just having all the documentation in their logbook all the time.
We could probably talk about this bit for quite a long time because there's a lot of to and fro there, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But I want to move on. I want to move on to talk about the Residential Logbook Association, because here again, I'm sat being the devil's advocate, if you don't mind me saying. And what makes you qualified to do this? What makes the Residential Logbook Association qualified to hold this data? You've already alluded to the fact that this is very secure information. It's really important. You're collating it from all sorts of different sources, including from government sources. It's really, really important, therefore, that you are reputable, immutable, secure, all those sorts of words, isn't it?
Yeah. Exactly. And I would just clarify that it's not the RLBA that holds any data. All the things we've talked about, all the data and documentation holding we've talked about, is being done at logbook company level. So we have a group of, we're just about to go to 7 companies in the RLBA who are all doing things slightly differently, have all come into this industry from slightly different starting points. And back in 2018, we were having discussions as a group of companies with the Ministry of Housing. It was in the MHCLG, as it used to be, obviously now DLUC. And we were trying to get access to data and have discussions with the Land Registry. And at the time, the main civil servant, who was very pro-logbooks, Matt Pryor, he said, guys, it's very hard for us to have a conversation with you individually as companies. So if you can organise, we can at least have conversations as a group. And once we did that and we started to engage through the home buying and selling group with the conveyancing industry, they flagged up the concerns that you just raised. So there was concerns that there was no consistency in the way logbook companies were holding data. There was concerns that companies might not have the right insurances and the right protections that you would expect a prop tech company to deal with. And so the Ministry of Housing came back to us as a group and said, actually, one of the things we would want you to do is put together a self-regulatory process and to establish some standards that could be trustable by particularly the legal industry, the conveyancing industry. And so we put together our first draft, and it's something that we're continuing to work on, but to make sure that any RLBA member company had the right technology insurances in place, had the right security in place. And it's an interesting tension, because what we all agreed as a group of companies was that we wanted a situation where we all competed to deliver new functionality and features and differences and to attack different parts of the market. So we wanted a vibrant market full of startup companies doing really interesting things. But at the base, we want to be able to reassure both government and the conveyancing industry that every company had the right cyber insurance, tech policies, that there were policies in place where if a company did shut down, that the logbooks could be transferred to another company. So there's some basic building blocks we put in place. So, obviously I would say this, if you're going to work, if a conveyancing company is going to work with a logbook company, make sure that they're an RLBA member, because they will have been through at least that process. And there's a second element to it, which is that the government also came to us and were worried that logbooks would help perpetuate property fraud. And they were very keen that we put in place some mechanism whereby that the identity of logbooks could be verified and checked. And to that end, we spent 3 years building the National Register of Logbooks, which launched in January 2023. And the idea of that is that all the logbooks that have been verified by a conveyancer through the transaction process can be listed on this register with an ID and a verification check. And we're now slowly signing up conveyancing software such that when a conveyancer is shown a logbook, they can actually check the register to see, is it the right validated logbook, etc., and with the right ID and the right owner of the logbook. So we become one extra part of the fight against property fraud, and not a supporter of property fraud or perpetuator of property fraud, as it were.
We're fast running out of time on the discussion, and I would really like you to share some examples of good practice, and this isn't a sales pitch, so be aware, but some really good examples of where law firms and logbook providers have worked together to achieve some of what you've talked about. Particularly, I'm interested in particular as to where it sits in the transaction best. You talked about there's a bit for the seller and there's a bit for the buyer, isn't there? So, yeah, how are you getting over that?
Yeah, so I think most of the logbook companies are in the same situation as the other upfront information companies when it comes to the upfront piece. That's still unfortunately taking time to roll out. It's amazing how few conveyancing bits of software can receive data digitally from any of the logbook companies or any of the upfront information companies. So that front piece is still taking time to develop. Almost all the really interesting stuff is happening amongst the logbook companies who are working with conveyancers at the back end, setting logbooks up. Actually, you covered in today's Conveyancer, you covered a couple of logbook companies just recently, ourselves and NDD, who were working with conveyancers at the back end, setting logbooks up for buyers. And the really interesting clients are actually asking the longer term questions. We can go through the setup process of setting up a conveyancer to sell logbooks from any of the companies at that back end. But the really interesting question is of those conveyancers who are asking, where do we take this? Rather than saying, right, we're just going to sell logbooks now, they're asking the question, which is, how do we actually build that new kind of relationship with a customer? What does it look like? If someone's going to own their home, let's say 10 years, what could and should the relationship be with the conveyancer be through that time? And what's the upsides we would like to look for? And then how do we build to that? And then you end up with a much more interesting plan, because what you're doing, we're working with the conveyancer to integrate sales messaging into our comms messaging. We're looking to spot opportunities to cross-sell and upsell through that period. And you jointly then start to plan out a much more interesting future.
And if a conveyancer wants to engage with a property logbook provider today, it's through the RLBA.
I would recommend going to the RLBA website, and there's currently 6 companies on there, another one to be added in the next couple of weeks, and choose one. I would counsel all companies to have a demo. So this isn't binary. This isn't do nothing and then all just jump in. I would encourage every conveyancing company in the country to get one of the logbook companies in and get them to show you what they do. Get 2 or 3 companies in at different times, and then I would get every conveyancer who works for those companies to set a free one up for their own home and play with it and ask questions, because this stuff is arriving. So one of the things we do, I was doing it this week with PM Law, making sure that all the conveyancers in the company had one, so they could look at it and play with it and understand it. And that would be my message to the whole conveyancing industry. Just get hold of one of the companies that has a free layer on their kind of packages, and just set a load of logbooks up for your staff, set them up for yourselves, look at them, play with them, ask questions, and start to think about how you might use it to further your own business. So, and that's even before you engage commercially with a logbook company. But just engage with the subject and start to ask questions.
Dare I say, I think it was not easy, that's not quite the right word, but it was possible, certainly during the pandemic and post-pandemic, to say as a conveyancer that we're too busy, we simply don't have time to look at innovation, and we certainly don't have time to do a huge amount of work on our business, not just in our business. I feel very strongly, like you do, that we have to do this. We have to start looking again at the business and what the direction of travel is. We were at the Conveyancing Association conference recently, and there was a really sort of big shout out about just talking to tech providers, not just logbook providers, but all sorts of different tech providers, giving them the opportunity to come in and show what you can do. And in fact, we mentioned it as we were chatting before, Nigel, that the CA's pledges now include logbooks specifically, don't they? So
yeah,
this is, as you say, something that's definitely coming down the track.
Yeah, and just as we said, just get people in and show you what they do. Engage with it. Get your staff to engage with it, to play with it. It breaks down those knowledge barriers. Every single conveyancer, even if they don't sell logbooks, should have one and know what they do.
It's been great to have you on the podcast. I'm not sure we can do logbooks justice in half an hour, but we've given it a good go.
Yeah,
thank you very much
indeed
for sharing your insight.
Thank you.
The Today's Conveyancer podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also available on todaysconveyancer.co.uk. My thanks to Nigel. Thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.
You're listening to the Today's Conveyancer podcast, the leading source of information for residential property lawyers in England and Wales. Don't forget to subscribe and sign up to our free newsletter at todaysconveyancer.co.uk. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.